Sandy Bridge processors are at their lowest prices yet, with an i5-2400 only setting you back about £15 to £20 here in the UK. But how does one of their lower end chips, the i3-2120, hold up almost 9 years later? So this video is mainly in response to the comments I received on my last video, where I built a £50 Optiplex gaming PC where people rightly called me out for criticising the i3-2120 for being a bottleneck to our other components, where in reality it was more likely that the 4GB of RAM was holding us back. But yes, this is the i3-2120 releasing in Q1 of 2011 for an MSRP of $120. It featured 2 cores with 4 threads clocked at 3.3 GHz, running on the 32nm lithography with a TDP of 65 watts. It was actually fairly power efficient, and the hyper-threading was definitely a nice selling point for a chip on the lower end. Generally, reviews at the time were positive of the i3, praising it for being a good performer with a cheap price for low-cost gaming rigs. But now with an average going rate of £5, I want to see how well it holds up in some newer titles. So, since my main machine is actually based on the Sandy Bridge architecture, running an i7-2600K with 20GB of DDR3 clocked at 1333 MHz and a GTX 780, I dropped the i3 into my system for a day to see what sort of performance we could get out of this chip. So, let's jump straight into the benchmarks. First up we have BeamNG Drive running at 1080p high settings and pulling off an average of 43 FPS, with 1% lows of 22 and 0.1% lows down to 12, and overall the game ran okay with these specs. Next up is CSGO, where we ran at 720p low settings and pulled off an average of 77 FPS, with 1% lows down to 34 and 0.1% lows of 16. But overall the game actually ran pretty well on this hardware and we didn't see any stutters or slowdowns at all. Next up we have the CS Source benchmark running at 1080p high, which pulled off an as expected average of 278 FPS, and overall this ran perfect on the i3 as it's more of a GPU dependent game anyway. Next up we have a brand new title with Halo's Master Chief Collection running at 1080p enhanced settings with an average of 103 FPS, with 1% lows down to 64 and 0.1% lows of 39. And overall, it ran pretty well on this system, although we were capped to about 90 on CPU usage, but it didn't create any other difficulties and ran perfectly. Next up we have GTA 5 running at 1080p very high settings and pulling off an average of 38 FPS, where unfortunately we still had issues with stuttering, where we pulled off 1% lows of 17 and 0.1% lows of 2, and it was very obvious that the game was having trouble loading in parts of the map while we were driving fast. But when we dropped it down to 1024x768 normal settings, the same that we used in the previous video, we saw a much improved 41 FPS on average with 1% lows of 24 and 0.1% lows of 19. And while yes, we actually got rid of all the stuttering issues we were having before, I am still not able to say that bottlenecks weren't caused by the i3 because of the experience we had running at the very high settings, which were exactly the same as we had in the previous video. But yes, I can't really conclude on that, but it was clear that the extra RAM definitely helped, as we were using about 10 gigs of RAM alone now. But overall, the game ran okay at normal settings. Next up we have Rise of the Tomb Raider running at 1080p high settings and pulling off an average of 62 FPS, with 1% lows of 29 and 0.1% lows of 9. And actually for a game that's only about 4 years old, released in 2016, I can't say it did too bad and I am pretty impressed with how well the i3 kept up. And next up we have Doom 2016 running at 1080p high settings and pulling off an average of 63 FPS, with 1% lows of 40 and 0.1% lows of 30. And actually, for a game like this, it really did not do too bad, and I'm pretty impressed with how well the i3 performed in this instance. And to finish us off, we have Minecraft running at 1080p fast, and while doing a creative free roam we pulled off an average of 123 FPS with 1% lows of 15 and 0.1% lows of 8. And well, any CPU is gonna slow down when you load in loads of chunks at once, but when we switched over to survival we pulled off a much better 211 FPS on average and 1% lows of 61 and 0.1% lows of 24. And overall Minecraft ran really well on this CPU. So, in conclusion, was I correct about my previous thoughts on the i3-2120? Honestly, the i3 held up surprisingly well in the newer, less demanding titles. I think that paired with a better GPU, the i3 really shows its potential. But unfortunately a GTX 780 and 20GB of RAM just isn't going to be an average pairing for this processor, and was only used to eliminate bottlenecks. The more realistic pairing was what I showed off in my Optiplex video. Yes, 4GB of RAM is going to hold it back somewhat, but for people on a budget, they sometimes just can't stretch their budget that far. But I will definitely agree with the comments. 4GB just isn't enough for day-to-day gaming in 2020, with 8 to 16 becoming the industry standard even for lower end PCs. So, thank you all very much for watching. I hope it was informative and I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.